Hi, I am John Atack, and this is my dear friend these many, many years, Edwin Stratton. Hello, Ed.
Hi.
And we've, on and off over the last 25 years, occasionally talked about the prohibition of drugs and what that's meant for our society in general. For me, it's a kind of cultural imperialism, where one segment of the population says you shouldn't take that drug. Now, if the drug is something like arsenic, which will kill you, then it probably is a good idea to restrict it a bit. And a drug like, say, Datura, which I don't think, is it restricted at all, do you know?
Not
Datura?
in law. No,
Which is mad
I
because
don't think it is.
in the 1890s, the India hump, I nearly said hump, the India Hump Drug Commission, sorry, the India Hemp Drugs Commission, which spent several years, and I think the report is published in 8 volumes, and they investigated, I think, 10,000 people. And they were investigating alcohol, cannabis, and datura use in India among the locals, not among people who are in the Raj wearing their solar topies, because, of course, they don't have any problems. At the end of their report, in simple, they said alcohol should remain illegal because it's so dangerous. Cannabis should remain legal because they couldn't find any harm. Having investigated more cases than anybody had, I think there were 500 cases in lunatic asylums that investigated, and that were meant to be cannabis psychosis. And they found that more than 200 of them have never taken cannabis. And when the police arrested anybody, they said, oh, cannabis psychosis. That was who diagnosed it. Somebody's acting wacky. They're on the wacky backy. So in fact, it didn't cause psychosis. And that they were pretty conclusive. I think 500 people they talked with. But the third drug they investigated was Datura, thorn apple, I think it's called also. And they said it should be absolutely extirpated, pulled up at the roots, because it was such a dangerous drug. And I don't think it's been prohibited. You can still grow the angel's trumpet, and if you just take a leaf from it, you have Datura.
Well, the harm principle is a red herring. We think that drugs are prohibited according to the harm that they cause, the harm that they have the potential for causing. I'm thinking about that David Nutt report.
Yeah, the Lancet, November 2000.
The Lancet report.
It's a journal of the Royal College of Surgeons, isn't it? In this country, the most eminent.
That's right. Yeah,
most
and it shows us. And it shows us the relative harms of drugs, and they're all over the place compared to the relative harms of the A, B, and C category.
Yeah, the way that
makes absolutely no sense.
Categorise in the UK that number 3 in terms of social and personal harm was cocaine. Number 2 was heroin, and number 1 was alcohol. That it actually scored nearly 20 points more than 70, where heroin and cocaine were around just over 50, because there are social harms as well as structural damage to the body. I remember watching a thing about heroin. I've never taken heroin. There are allegations that I was a heroin addict when I joined Scientology, but I've never taken heroin. I've never even seen it in the raw. I don't want anybody to show me any, just so I won't be able to say that. But I think it was pretty normal when I was a youngster that some drugs were considered safe and some drugs were considered dangerous, and that heroin was very much considered dangerous by my set, not a drug anybody that I knew as a teenager took. I later came to meet people who were former addicts, and that was very interesting. But on this, there was a TV series called Hooked in 1990-91 on TV, and they had a pathologist, who showed you a section of a brain, the brain of an alcoholic, and there was a piece missing called a wet brain, I think, in America.
Yeah.
And then he showed a brain slice from a dead heroin addict, and it was all still there. And he said, alcohol is a structural drug. You get high by your brain cells dying. That's what the euphoria is. It's actually your brain dying. I don't need any help with that. Whereas heroin is a functional drug. It simply fills the receptors in your brain for the so-called endogenous morphines, endorphins, enkephalins, whatever. And that was a real. And then they showed film of a guy who went up. He was a roofer, so he went up on roofs, and he was also a heroin addict. And they showed it. He fixed up in the morning, went up on the roofs, and I kind of thought, no, you're meant to be comatose, aren't you, when you take this stuff? It's. But apparently not. So that was a bit of shock, and I've been fascinated by I think the history of everything is fascinating. How do things happen? How did we come to this impasse where, by the end of the 20th century, 60% of the people who are in American prisons wouldn't have been there under the laws in 1900. So the laws in 1900 caused property, arson, rape, robbery, theft, murder. They're all part of the law. 60% of the people in American prisons, so I've read, 100 years later, were there for offences that didn't exist, which is to say, largely to do with drugs in one way or another.
And the majority of those are non-violent.
Yeah, and they're victimless. That expression that was used about homosexuality when it was finally decided that people could do what they wanted to do with their private parts, but that it was a victimless crime if it was indeed a crime. What is a crime that has no victim? So I've really over the years wanted to understand why people come to what I consider irrational decisions when there isn't evidence to support them, and why people become so passionate about the choices they've made. So if you suggest to somebody that alcohol is a drug, and that by drinking alcohol they're taking a drug or taking drugs, they can become quite annoyed with you. But it is a drug. Yeah. By definition, it's a drug. Then we've got this whole notion of drugs not meaning pharmaceuticals. There are medical drugs and street drugs. So if you buy heroin on the street, then it's heroin. But if you get it from a pharmacy or an hospital, where it is used in hospitals, it's called diamorphine. And one of these is a street drug. And the other one, now, of course, we've got fentanyl and carfentanil and things that are just unbelievably dangerous. But so, a short history of the prohibition of drugs. In 1885, in the United States, what I believe is called the Chinese Exclusion Act was ruled. And this was the decision that people would not be allowed to immigrate into the United States if they were of Chinese origin. So that gives me pause for thought. What had happened was that a lot of
Why the Chinese?
Why the Chinese? Well, chop suey, isn't it? People just don't like chop suey.
I just can't stand it.
There were a huge amount of Chinese immigrants to California over quite a long period of time, but a lot of them were brought in for the Pacific Railroad, to build the railroad. They were horrifically treated. Thousands died they'd dynamite a rock and lose a few of the so-called coolies to that. It was a savage and brutal treatment. They were cheap. It was a way of bringing a special economic zone to California, as they're now called. And then you got a depression in the US, after the Civil War, after the building of the railroad, so into the 1880s, where it's decided that there isn't enough work. And so the best solution is to get rid of the Celestials, as they're called. There was even a group called the Society of Sinophobes. Now, you'd thought it'd be people who didn't like Chinese, but it's actually people who are frightened, phobes of the Sinos, the Chinese.
Yeah.
Used with the other kind of Sino. And at this point in history, I only found this out quite recently. I had some vague idea. I knew about the Chinese Exclusion Act, but in the Northwest, in the US, in Washington State, for example, Chinese people were killed. They were herded onto boats to be sent down to San Francisco so they could disembark back to China. Didn't work. So roll on and you get two situations coming together. You want to get rid of, or the US wanted to get rid of as many Chinese as possible. But they also wanted to be able to trade in China because there was then a major depression in the US, collapse of banks, pretty much subprime business all over again. They've sold stuff that's worthless and they've run off with the money that actually is worth something and bought ranches for themselves, all of that kind of thing. And it's decided by a fair amount of American businessmen, the plutocrats, the ones with the money, that the only way to get out of this depression is to sell things to China. Because it's a huge market. So they want to get in on the trading concessions, Shanghai, Macau, Hong Kong. They want, where the British, the Dutch, and the French are trading. They want in on this, as do the Germans at this time. And a way of doing this is to ban opium, because China has fought 2 wars to try and stop the British, particularly, from pushing opium. There was some going in from Persia or Iran, but the trade was started. Clive of India in the 18th century, East India Company, they set up poppy fields in Bengal, Bangladesh and Bengal as they are now, and shove this, tons and tons of opium into China. And the Chinese aren't very keen on this. So they fight 2 wars and fail to stop it happening. So by saying we will make opium illegal, they not only have the chance in the US of getting rid of the Chinese they don't want, but they can also make friends with the Chinese. So they can actually send people back and then sell stuff to them. It's a win-win basis. And there we have the kernel, the motivating force. Now, what's interesting is what they're banning is what's called smoking opium, which is the unrefined form. They're not banning heroin, morphine, codeine, laudanum, any of the more refined and therefore more powerful forms. It's specifically aimed at the Chinese opium smoker. And there is a reasoning that begins to dawn, which is, I have a little library of books on this subject, in fact. But my favorite is David Mustoe, a book called The American Disease. And he was a medical doctor who lectured at Yale, professor at Yale, I believe, in both medicine and history. And this book was written in 1973. So it's a long time ago when we were children. It's a report to the United States government by a man who was later thrown off the commission, a man called Wright, because he was a heavy drinker. He observes that one of the most unfortunate phases of the habit of smoking opium in this country was the large number of women who have become involved and were living as common law wives or cohabiting with Chinese in the Chinatowns of our various cities. So, spectacled I am now. This idea of race is the most important idea in this argument whatsoever. Goes on further, having said that women, by which he means white women, will cohabit with Chinese. I mean,
why would they do that unless there was a drug involved?
it's the only reason anybody would spend time with a Chinaman if they're a decent American person. It's absolutely crazy. Goes
they
on,
will have been hooked on that demon drug.
Demon drug. Yeah. I mean, I was surprised, reading about opium dens and finding that to this day, there are places where Chinese, particularly Chinese businessmen, still found throughout the world where the Chinese are. They'll go and have a pipe of opium at lunchtime and then they'll go back to work. I mean, and there is so much less potent than heroin, let alone fentanyl or carfentanil, the other things. This guy Wright also warns about cocaine. This is before the First World War. And he says, he warned of cocaine's, and here we quote, encouragement among the humbler ranks of the Negro population in the South. In the South, the cocaine problem among Negroes greatly troubled law enforcement officers, he stated. And again, we quote, the lower order of working Negro being not willing as a rule to go to much trouble or send to any distance for anything. Intoxication by the drug made it's certain that it was brought directly to him from New York and other northern states where it was manufactured. So he's starting to talk about the Chinese, white women, Negroes taking drugs. It goes on that criminal classes everywhere were starting to use cocaine, especially those concerned in the white slave traffic. Remember the white slave traffic? Great point.
White slave traffic.
White slave traffic. It has been authoritatively stated, says Wright, authoritatively stated, that cocaine is often the direct incentive to the crime of rape by the Negroes of the South and other sections of the country. We don't know if that's east, west, and north, all the sections of the country, or which sections, because he doesn't enlighten us.
The fear of having our white women raped by black men.
Yeah. And this, of course, takes flower in why is cannabis prohibited in this country? It was prohibited in 1928. And I've got two books. The guy actually wrote the first book and he hadn't got to the end of the story. It's a professor writing just about cannabis in the UK. Two books. And the reason it was made illegal, in 1923, Britain abstained in a vote to criminalize cannabis at the League of Nations, a motion brought by the Egyptians, who, again, their mental hospitals, when the policeman put somebody in, they said, cannabis psychosis. But unlike in India, where they'd had people who spoke the language, the guy that wrote the report from Egypt, it was a British mandate at the time, I believe, Egypt. He was the head of the supervisor of mental hospitals to the locals, but he didn't speak Arabic. So he didn't interview anybody. And he just took these reports that said, so they went to the League of Nations and said, let's make it illegal. Britain abstained. 1923. The next year, I think it was, 24, Canada suddenly makes cannabis illegal. It's not illegal in the US. The Marijuana Tax Act will be 1937. So this is, interestingly enough, the first Western nation to repeal this law was the first one, as far as I know, to institute such a law. You've got things like the El Paso Ordinance, which I think was 1914. But for a whole country to ban cannabis, Canada made it first, 24. And the sole reason, as far as I can make out, was a novel called The Black Candle, written under the name Janie Canuck, original name there, by a woman who was a juvenile magistrate, which I think indicates that she was a magistrate judging juveniles. But looking at the content of the book, she was fairly juvenile. And she talks about the proud white race being sullied by the importation of, by blacks having sex with them, which was probably happening all over Canada at the time. And this is caused by cannabis or cocaine or heroin or anything you like. So the whole reason for prohibition in the UK was that Canada had made it illegal.
Yeah.
So this is apartheid, segregation. We're still in a time when it's believed that the Negroid is a different species, a different race, even a different genus from which we get the word genocide, which if there was ever a wrong word, that's it, because there was only one genus of human beings. There's only pretty much one species of human beings, let alone genus. But there is the focus that these people do this with, as you probably know, with marijuana. The term means anything you can smoke, pretty much. Rough tobacco, something you can smoke is marijuana. But it is then you get Harry J. Anslinger creating the Narcotics Bureau. And he wants to achieve what the same kind of prestige that Hoover has for the FBI. And he initially states that there is no proof of any danger from cannabis in the early 30s. So he's not interested in it. And then in 1937, you get the Marijuana Tax Act. And this situation, which David Musto talks about in here, where the American Medical Association arrived late at the hearings and say, we're very sorry, we didn't realize that by marijuana, you mean cannabis. Cannabis is a really useful drug. It's really safe. It's really helpful. So how does one explain this? How do we get into the deeper workings of this? That the evidence, the amount of times I've seen somebody with a cigarette or a cigar in one hand and a glass of alcohol in the other, going on about how bad drugs are. This is a part of my experience. I sat with the guy once and watched him down 5 shots of malt whiskey while he was complaining about his sister being a druggie because she smoked cannabis. I have seen strange things in my life.
Yeah.
So what do you think it is, that this kind of cognitive dissonance that's arisen over drugs? Why has it become such an issue? Because in the 19th century, it wasn't. Nobody cared. You go and buy arsenic and sniff it if you wanted, and people did.
Yeah.
Freud was very keen on cocaine. He loved it, Enough to kill a small horse, according to Robin Williams. Uber Coca, one of Freud's early papers, or how he cured morphine addiction by using cocaine. He wrote the paper 2 weeks after he started the treatment, and the guy spent 7 years as a double addict, but let's not worry about that. What's the shift that takes place? Why do people become so passionate in their beliefs about drugs and what drugs do?
Yeah, when do they identify drugs with themselves?
Yeah.
When people identify themselves as a whiskey person or a G&T person, the specific types of people. Oh, you're a G&T person. Oh, great.
Pink gin.
Yeah.
It's true. It is. It's a badge of identity, and it's true. We associate with that. I mean, I can remember, I smoked cannabis as a teenager, and then I'm 19, I arrive at Scientology and they say, oh, you can't do that because you'll have to wait 6 weeks before you can have a counseling session. So that was me done. They'd later in court claim that, it was with their help that I'd stopped taking drugs. Well, I guess in some ways that's true. They said, stop doing it. I stopped doing it because it wasn't that important.
Yeah.
But I did find that it was interesting being in situations with my friends where they were all sitting smoking spliff and I wasn't, and that there is a kind of group identity. There's a thing there, I suppose.
And there's a weird sort of snobbery as well with certain drug users, like heroin users have got a certain altitude that you don't have as a cannabis user. This is like a proper drug. Cannabis users have the same kind of thing going on where we take cannabis. That's what we do. We smoke cannabis. That makes us superior to people who have fallen down the rabbit hole. into heroin use. And Lemmy was almost proud of being a speed user. Almost proud of it, you know. We do develop these attachments.
Well, Hitler was certainly very attached to speed, wasn't he? I mean, whoa.
Yeah, Hitler and meth.
Yeah. But, and I wondered, you know, reading about, it's a book about the Spice Islands, and years ago, and they're talking about the Spice Islands were swapped for New Amsterdam. So New York and Spice Islands went in trade to the Dutch. And, you know, at a time when nutmeg was worth more by weight than gold, you know, the spices were, but this book about, which we'll dig out a title for somewhere, it's on my bookshelf downstairs, so I can probably find it. And it's about the voyage to and from, and one is windward and the other is leeward. So you need all the crew active only in one direction. So the rest of the time they drink grog, rum. And the thing I particularly remember was the Dutch Navy rule that if you were caught fighting at all, imagine this, you've got a ship full of drunks. If you're caught fighting, your hand would be nailed to the mast. And as soon as you could move it away, you were free again. So as soon as enough of your hand had rotted away or given way so you could get it off the nailhead, and you're going, and that's a, you know, we evolved out of that society, let's put it that way, that our laws come, that's in the 17th century, the 18th century. The rum, sodomy and the lash, as Churchill said of the Royal Navy, that was what kept it going. And the cat of nine tails, with little metal bits on it, all of this incredible viciousness. I thought about that. I thought about the Vikings, you know, and sort of like, these are alcohol cultures, aren't they? They're incredibly violent.
Oh, yeah.
And which is not to say that alcohol is necessary for that. Some of the Native American peoples were pretty violent without having any booze at all. The Cherokee, and the other Iroquois tribes, the Apaches, the Lakota, the Cheyenne, they did some, well, go and watch A Man Called Horse if you want to know how unpleasant it was. But alcohol will appeal to a certain temperament, or it will overwhelm a certain temperament. You're watching, you know, particularly say South Asians or East Asians, who, as with Native Americans and Australian Aborigines, they don't metabolize alcohol in the vast quantities that Europeans can, and so you can watch them after that third drink, they're starting to go, and it's sort of wondering, what is it about having brain cells die that is so appealing? You know? And different artists use different drugs. You know, Modigliani, the painter, smoked cannabis. Picasso liked opium.
Cocaine is the big finance drug.
Yeah, if you're going to be a lawyer or a judge, obviously, or into the stock market, you need something that's upmarket amphetamines, and cocaine fits the bill. One of the things that Musto talks about is the scrutiny on Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola before the Harrison Act in 1914, because this was seen as a way for Negroes to get hold of cocaine, and which has always been denied by Coca-Cola, though it is unrefined. It's not actually cocaine that they were using, is it? They were using coca leaves, but you'd still get a buzz from, you know, Coca-Cola or Pepsi, which were first developed by pharmacists as a way of selling. Coca-Cola was sold as a brain tonic in the 1890s. That's what the posters say. It'll pep up your thinking. It will sharpen your thinking.
Seven Up was lithiated.
Oh my, I didn't know that.
Yeah, had a lithium in it. It was a real mood stabilizer.
7 Up. And root
Yeah.
beer was made with sassafras, which is the natural source for MDMA.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
tell about the pop that we give to our kids to drink. You know, dandelion and burdock. Who knows what's in there? You know,
Burdock.
burdock.
What's burdock? Burdock's probably pharmaceutical equivalent of
High grade
something.
heroin.
Huh?
Yeah, probably.
High grade heroin. Yeah, burdock.
Give us half an ounce of burdock, eh? Oh dear. But then we've seen the other end of it, where, say, Portugal in 2000 decided to decriminalize the use of all drugs and treat it as a health issue. They saw their violent crime statistics plummet. They saw their addiction rates plummet because addicts started going to get help. And, you know, generally it all got a lot nicer in Colorado after they legalized cannabis 2 years in. They did a survey and they found that not a crime had dropped, not just drug crime, obviously, but that there'd been a decrease of 11% in alcohol sales. And given that cannabis on the Lancet scale, the largest survey of drugs ever undertaken under Professor Nutt's supervision at Imperial College, there's a footnote on the report, and it says they score it at 25 in terms of harm, you know, with alcohol at 70 something. But the only reason is because people smoke it with tobacco. That as yet, there are 0 social harms associated with cannabis. 0.
Yeah.
You know, I think Bill Hicks was pretty good on that subject about, you know, they're not going to rob your house. You're going to find them sitting in the doorway, you know, outside and going, hey, how are you going? It's a fairly pro-social drug, though it has been used to whip hashishan to a frenzy, we're told. I'm not really sure how you do that. You just see that, can't you? You give somebody like an ounce of Mazar al-Sharif and say, right, smoke that and then go and kill someone. It's like, yeah, really, that's going to work.
That's not going to work. Crystal meth, yeah.
Exactly. PCP's got a bit of a reputation that way.
Yeah.
But even amphetamines.
Shabu.
Stormtroopers, you know.
Yeah.
So, and where are we going to go now? That the bias in this country, the only thing that's changed in terms of the law about, let's say, cannabis, for which I'm not aware that there is a suspicion of that it might be harmful to those who develop bowel cancer. That's the only medical thing that's been put forward by the advisory committee in this country. One member of it holds that it might be. I believe there's a study underway in Israel at the moment to determine whether there is any truth in that. But given that it's a proven medication for pain, I have a friend who is diagnosed with fibromyalgia, i.e. pain in more than 9 places, I think is the technical definition of that. Sounds good, doesn't it? And she's had all sorts of diagnoses over the years. I've known her for 8 years. And every specialist she's seen has given her a different form of arthritis or rheumatism or something that's wrong with her. And they put her on some pretty horrific things, you know, something that's so strong you only inject it once every 3 months, you know. And all the way through this, I've been saying, you know, arthritis, pain, insomnia, these are things that cannabis is known to be helpful for. And maybe some cannabidiol, which seems to have become legal all over the world. I'm not sure how, but, you know, the British Pharmaceutical Society said they were, this is about when it suddenly started happening about 7 or 8 years ago, they sent out a notification that nobody was allowed to sell this stuff, and everybody ignored them because, of course, they aren't in fact a legal body of any kind with any authority. But so you can buy cannabidiol, and I kept suggesting to her, try it because it's not psychoactive. You won't get stoned on it. It can't do you any harm that anybody's ever found used for 2,500 years to give it a try. And eventually she did, about 3 months ago or something. And she couldn't believe what had happened. She'd been in pain all of these years. She was sleeping properly. She wasn't anxious. And you kind of go, well, because in the 1990s, they found that cannabis, various of the agents in it, the delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, THC, the stuff that gets you high, or one of the things that gets you high, is produced as anandamide in the human brain, the same molecule. They found that cannabidiol was produced, and there are at least those two pathways, CB1, CB2 pathways, that control more aspects of human metabolism than any other known pathway. The endorphin pathway is, the only thing it's not involved with is respiration, which is why it can't kill you, because drugs tend to stop your breathing, which is not, alcohol can do it too, not good for you. So I talked with another friend who is diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and she said to me that she'd always wanted to get high on cannabis, but she couldn't. And the penny dropped. I kind of went, massive overproduction of anandamide when in the high phase, and then collapse, underproduction. The solution to that is cannabidiol, because that regulates the use of THC. And so I went online and sure enough found these testimonies by people who've been diagnosed with bipolar, didn't get on with the lithium, and they found that by taking a dose of cannabidiol, they stayed level. They didn't have the mania, but nor did they seem to be getting the dark depression. You sort of go, well, is the suggestion that during the last 30 years, since we found out these are a part of the human body, there should have been a bit more research? Because if your levels are too low or too high of one of these things, then maybe something will go wrong. That takes us into a whole subject area, but the Canadian study of COVID-19 saying cannabidiol is an effective antiviral, which is up on the National Institutes of Health website, which is the US government medical website. And it's long been known that this is an antiviral. So we started off talking about prohibition, and here we are talking about cannabis, which is one of my favorite subjects, because it does seem to be such a helpful substance for so many people. Of course, if it isn't helpful for somebody, they shouldn't use it. But and if it can give you a dry mouth, should be warned about that. And I personally don't think that smoking it's a good idea, but I'm not keen on smoke. I don't inhale bonfires either. Though, do you remember the name of the guy? He did it. His first study was showing that there were more carcinogens in cannabis than there were in tobacco. So he became a big hero. And then he did a longitudinal study of quite a lot of people. And he said, oh, this is weird. I've looked at people who smoke tobacco, people who smoke cannabis, people who smoke cannabis and tobacco together. The ones that smoke just cannabis have the same incidence of lung cancer as a non-smoker. And the ones who smoke tobacco and cannabis together have a lower incidence than those who just smoke tobacco. Maybe there's something in there that's good for us. Then you get off into the this guy who had lymphatic cancer, and I think it was lymphatic, and he was busted in California, I think, for growing cannabis. And he was contacted by the guy who diagnosed him, and who said, "You're still alive? This long after diagnosis? What have you been doing?" He said, "I smoke an ounce of cannabis a day."
An ounce a day.
An ounce a day. But it caused the doctor to say, it's got to be having an effect, or the famous Nixon studies, where Nixon's commission, as all commissions I'm aware of into investigation into cannabis, they all say the same thing, which is leave it alone. You know, the US Panama Canal, the New York Mayor's report, the LaGuardia report in 44, the Hemp Drugs Commission in 1890, whenever, they all say, legalize it, don't criticize it. Though they usually take a lot more words to say it.
Yeah.
Nixon's commission came back and said the same thing, which is what led Jimmy Carter to promise that he was going to legalize cannabis. But we won't get into that. He, did his best, bless him. It wasn't good enough. But Nixon was so incensed by this that he went to the University of West Virginia and said, prove that it damages the immune system. And they did tests in mice with cancer, and all the control group mice died. They got 3 different kinds of cancer. And all of the group that had been given cannabis survived, and they weren't allowed to publish their results. It was almost 20 years. And you kind of go, that might have helped cancer research. That might have helped make life easier for some people. But it's our beliefs
that's
that
politically.
I'm sorry, Ed?
That's politically convenient science.
Of which we see a plenitude across the years. So,
yeah, of course.
Has that stirred or stimulated any concluding remarks on your part, do you think?
Oh, it's just interesting looking at cannabis from the perspective of harm through that lens, which is why it's now a Class B drug, because it's so harmful.
Yeah.
There's still the old saw that cannabis causes mental illness, and that seems to be growing in momentum rather than overturning that belief as a result of liberalization of drug laws in Oregon, in Canada, in Portugal, across much of the world. We've now got data that doesn't seem to show an increase in the amount of schizophrenia or mental illness people suffer in societies that smoke versus those that don't.
In fact, David Nutt again examined these numbers, and he looked at what a clever man. He looked at the statistics for mental illness since, I think, 1963 in the UK. And he said, cannabis use is increasing throughout this period, and mental illness is actually going down. So just that simple statistic. It was the Bristol meta-analysis that made things go murky. And they included an awful lot of studies which were not viable. They were not large enough study sizes. They didn't consider founders. It's often the case. I mean, probably as many as 90% of these little studies, they're indicative of the need for more research, but they have no value in themselves until you've got 1,000 people in a study. You're just building up little fractions. And what they said 2 things. The first was that schizophrenics were likely to have an onset of schizophrenia 5 years earlier, very specific, 5 years earlier, if they smoked cannabis. David Nutt points out that is 1 person in 7,000. Alcohol, on the other hand, 1 person in 2 will develop dementia 5 years earlier as a consequence of the use of alcohol. Just 1 in 2, 1 in 7,000. The other thing is the famous cannabis psychosis. And as yet, I've only seen an interview with 1 person who's had this. And I'm interested in it. And he was a Jamaican yardie, a Jamaican gangster, who again was smoking an ounce of cannabis a day. That is about, if I were taking cannabis, that's about 80 times what I would take. And if you translate that into alcohol, instead of having my reasonable 1 or 2 glasses of wine, I had 80 or 160 glasses of wine in one day, it probably wouldn't make me very well. So the incredible dose. And he was talking about weeks of smoking this quantity. and he went nuts. And within about
Was he
3 or 4
smoking tobacco along with that? Was he
No.
smoking tobacco along with that? No.
I don't think so, but because it was on the television, I wasn't able to ask him any questions, unfortunately. But he was smoking an ounce of cannabis, and he went crazy, and it lasted, I think, for 3 days, and he was okay. And then what he found was that if he had the slightest amount of cannabis, it induced the psychosis. So it would seem that it's a kind of self-healing form. Beyond that, yes, studies of mental illness, nothing has ever supported the idea. In fact, quite the opposite, that in some forms of mental illness, schizophrenia, for example, cannabidiol, I think there are 3 studies, that all of them too small to be in any way conclusive, but that have shown that the same benefits that can be obtained through major tranquilizers, for some people, they can get from cannabidiol, with no side effects, with no possible harm. I think, so we're in a very, very peculiar area. The idea of gateway drugs, these silly, nonsensical ideas, where it's like, this drug seems to have proved itself to be pretty safe. In fact, the British Medical Association years ago said it was the least toxic drug they'd ever investigated. The American Medical Association, every year or two, petitions to be allowed to research cannabis because it has a long history as a medicine. Many people are probably unaware that cannabis tinctures have been used as medicines for over 2,000 years. And there is now very good evidence to support those uses, for anxiety, for insomnia, for pain. In this country, when the Home Secretary the other year was, I don't know if we can let epileptics with these 2 specific forms take cannabis, there's no precedent. You're going, it's already legal. Sativex, Nabilone, Marinol. They've been licensed here for years. Even the last of them, Sativex, is about 20 years, but only for people with multiple sclerosis. Because the other known effect of cannabis is it's the best agent for unstiffening muscles, for spasticity in muscles. So wild and hairy. What about beyond that? Is there anything you'd like to add to that on reflection?
No, there's a thought.
We can always return to the topic at a later date, but and I think we probably will, because we've been talking about it since we first met, one way and another. I had a bizarre thought, which was, people generally don't know that swing jazz is born out of people for whom cannabis is their culture. In 1990, alcohol had become illegal under the Volstead Act in the US, but cannabis was perfectly legal. And so there were cafes where you'd sit around and smoke dope. And 2 of the most significant figures of jazz, Sidney Bechet, great clarinetist, and Louis Armstrong, were both cannabis smokers. So was Bing Crosby. There's the thought. Isn't it? I'm dreaming.
Bong Crosby.
He was very surprised when his son became an alcoholic and said, well, why doesn't he just smoke shit like the rest of us? That's Bing Crosby said. Gene Krupa went.
Bong Crosby.
Absolutely. Gene Krupa was sent to jail for smoking cannabis. Robert Mitchum, the actor, was sent down. We have pictures of Marilyn Monroe smoking the spliff. But jazz, that really happy, bouncy jazz culture that came up through the Depression, it has a lot to do with cannabis because it was legal. And it's said that Armstrong wouldn't perform without it. And he thought it was a wonderful world. What are you going to say? And I had this speculation. What would have happened if the medical evidence is that prohibition of alcohol was good for the health of America? It's that simple. It was good for the health of America. And it was gentle prohibition because it wasn't for consuming or possessing it. that you would be got. It was for trafficking or producing it. Even so, what if the first thing that Franklin Delano Roosevelt did when he became president hadn't been which was in March 1933, to repeal that act, to push that act away? What if alcohol had remained prohibited as it is in Islamic countries? I mean, we've seen it doesn't necessarily stop violence. Beheading still does occur in places where people don't drink. But what if the US had actually carried on with alcohol gone, with cannabis as the central drug? I mean, we'd probably have lost World War II. We're not going out there, man. No. We don't like that. But But it's a thought, the kind of alpha male, aggressive, pushy culture that is so tied in with alcohol, you know.
What sort of culturally different would we have were we addicted to a different drug,
or using it?
If society were built around methamphetamine, for example,
that'd be amazing.
What sort of culture would we live in? Would it be ultra violent?
But Clockwork Orange, which was adrenochrome, which I thought was an invented substance, but Spike pointed out to me, she went and looked it up on Wikipedia. People cheat, they look things up. You know, when I was a kid, you had to know things. You know, you had to be able to say, well, I think it's this and this. But these days, people have just got a phone and they look it up. It's terrible. But adrenochrome is a real substance, apparently. But
cheats.
Cheats, they are. That's it. Cheats and cads. That we have seen a society that ran on amphetamines because the Nazi German society, one of the drug pamphlets that was handed out in one of my kids' schools said that the Germans and the Japanese used amphetamines during World War II. And it reminded me of an conversation I had with a friend of mine who was a nurse for the RAF during the Battle of Britain. And she said the poor kids came down terrified out of their wits. We poured more amphetamines into them and they went back up. So, you know, we've seen a brief phase. You know, the Third Reich was an amphetamine culture to some extent. But then so was Johnny Cash, you know.
Reciprocally, the British Army, especially the North African, the 8th Army in North Africa, amphetamines. It wasn't crystal meth like the Germans were taking, but it was amphetamine sulfate.
Yeah.
Amphetamine sulfate, quite frankly, has got a much worse come down than crystal meth. So I think I'd prefer the crystal meth. I prefer to be in the Wehrmacht.
Yeah, and you would have had Erwin Rommel as a commander. I mean, what a great man he was. The Desert Fox.
Yeah.
He was one of my. I had Stonewall Jackson and him and, you know, Ord Wingate. They were heroes to me as a child. I've since found out they were all bad people. But particularly Ord Wingate. But, it's an interesting thought to what extent I see cultures as having particular temperaments. So, you know, as W.H. Auden said, the 20th century is the age of anxiety. And the arts show that temperament somehow. And I think after the First World War, there's been this terrible rupture that, you know, people who believed that this was going to be cleansing, the intelligentsia in the lead up to the First World War. I mean, it was first called the Great War in 1911, 3 years before it started. It'd all been planned out. There were books being written, particularly in Britain. There are over 400 novels about German saboteurs had been published before World War I. Germans weren't bothered about that kind of thing. They didn't write any novels about British saboteurs. They were bothered about exporting what they considered a superior culture, which was better capable of looking after its citizens, what Bismarck called socialism, where you look after the people, they're educated, they're housed. They wanted to export that to the world. It's funny how things turn out, isn't it? But that after the First World War, many of the artists, because half of them were dead, so they'd lost all their mates, Oskar Kokoschka goes up into the hills and lives with an anatomically correct rag doll because he can't stand people anymore. Ivor Gurney ends up in a mental hospital. Stanley Spencer is somewhat tormented. That it's a difficult time. Then World War II comes and Auschwitz and all of that, and people go, what's the point? So any art that's about something joyful or beautiful is decorative or ornamental. You know, there's a culture that imposes itself and says, these are sad times and confusing times, and we better upset people, you know. So we get the absurd nonsense of Damien Hirst, Tracy Emin, Jeff Koons, as opposed to the brilliant conceptualism of Maurizio Catalan. It's not because I'm, you know, old school or something. I do recognize that people like Marcel Duchamp made a tremendous contribution to the arts and thought. I think Damien Hirst hasn't, but that could just be me. You know, what do we say? So, a longer commodious vicus, as James Joyce said. I don't know what it means, but we have arrived at a point where we should probably taper off and fade out. So I'm Jon Atash.
Taper off, like when you take drugs.
Not fade away. And thank you so much, Edwin, for joining me. And we will speak again at the other end of the bridge. No doubt.
Yes.
Hi, Jon here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.
Pink gin, pink gin.